Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our Introduction to Biblical Studies course. Today you can see we have come to Paris, France, and it's very appropriate because in this class on medieval and Renaissance exegesis, we're going to study at least a couple thinkers who had ties to this great city. And it makes sense. Paris was an important university city. The University of Paris was one of the early medieval universities that was very influential in the life of the late medieval church that set the stage for what would happen later during the Renaissance and then during and after the Protestant Reformation. Let's go ahead and look first, before our agenda for today, let's go ahead and look at this chart which shows you our 6 main concepts that we're studying throughout the course. And you can see on your screen we have in red the 6 figures we discussed in our last class on the patristic era. I've added a couple names from medieval thinkers, St. Thomas Aquinas and Nicholas of Lyra. You can see that although these 6 categories, these 6 concepts have been discussed extensively in modern theology, all of them were at issue, at least in some way, in the ancient and medieval world. So while theology has developed a lot in the modern era, it's not exclusively a modern creation. Now let's look at our agenda for today. We're first going to look at the medieval context. What made the Middle Ages different from the patristic period that came before it, as well as the Renaissance and modern period that came after it? Then we're going to look at St. Thomas Aquinas and Nicholas of Lyra, 2 key medieval interpreters, one Dominican, one Franciscan. Got to keep that balance. And then we're going to conclude by talking about what changed with the dawn of the Renaissance and the Reformation. But first, let's begin with the historical context. As you look at your screen, you can see some essential contrasts. During the patristic era, this earlier era in church history, most of the theologians were bishops. Therefore, the theological texts that they wrote, they weren't doing theology just for the fun of doing theology. They were doing it for specific purposes. Their texts are ad hoc. They're written to specific situations, all of which deal with pastoral goals. The enemies of the church during the patristic era were principally external. Heresies, others who were causing problems for a local diocese. Also very important, during the patristic era, the church incorporated the entire Mediterranean world. Remember, Augustine was the bishop of Hippo. That's in modern-day Algeria. You also have Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, the Middle East, modern-day Lebanon, Egypt, Syria. All of these places were Christian at that time. As the page turns to the medieval era and Islam begins to rise, again, that's my event that sets the two apart, although no one has definitively defined what separates the patristic era from the medieval era. There's no official definition of where the early church fathers end. There are some scholars who consider Bernard of Clairvaux, even in the 11th century, still to be a father. Once we get to the medieval era, most theologians are monks, or at the very least they are under the influence of monastic life. The mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, take some monastic elements of their heritage but apply it to a more active vocation out in the streets. A consequence of that is that theology is increasingly done for its own sake. It is seen as a legitimate religious activity to pursue the sacred mysteries because that leads us closer to God. That's a change in the monastic mind of the Middle Ages. When I say opposing internal enemies, monks were more focused. They had fled the world. That's why they're in a monastery. The monks are focused on avoiding sinfulness and avoiding temptation within the monastic enclosure. Therefore, the enemies were not so much heretics or those who wanted to attack the church, but the enemy within. And finally, the church grows increasingly European. The divisions between the East and the West become worse, and indeed, with the Great Schism in 1054, the East becomes autonomous from the West. So the church is becoming increasingly European. So all of that sets the stage for 2 important medieval interpreters. And again, I pick these 2 in the interest of time. Bernard of Clairvaux made contributions. Others certainly made contributions. Indeed, during the Middle Ages, theology began with Scripture. St. Thomas Aquinas is a Dominican, and for our purposes, of course, Thomas Aquinas is important for all sorts of reasons that are not relevant to this class. But he considered theology as a science. This is from the opening article of the Summa, question 2. and he describes the relationship between Scripture and divine revelation as Scripture being based on divine revelation. File that thought away, because we're going to retrieve it when we get to Vatican II especially and talk about the connection between divine revelation and Scripture. We'll even talk about it a little bit when we look at the Council of Trent in a few classes. Thomas Aquinas devotes 2 disputed questions in the Summa explicitly to matters of biblical hermeneutics. He's going to address in one question, question 9 of the first article, on the presence of metaphor in sacred Scripture. That is particularly important because already here in the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas is identifying literary forms in the Bible. He's identifying literary genres. That would be controversial into the 20th century. Moreover, in question 10, he's going to talk about the fourfold senses of sacred Scripture, and much of what he teaches in the Summa is in the Catechism today. Turning our attention now to the Franciscan Nicholas of Lyra, living about a century later, Nicholas of Lyra was something of a new Jerome. He also learned Hebrew from Jewish masters, and unlike most medieval interpreters, he was studying the Old Testament in Hebrew. He contributed to what we call the glossa ordinaria. These glossa were like an early form of a study Bible. They contained little comments that went along with the biblical text. What's very notable for us is that Nicholas resurrects the debate we saw in our last class with St. Jerome and Augustine. For Nicholas, he used the Hebrew to correct interpretations that he considered deficient. All of this sets the stage for what would come in the next few centuries, the Renaissance and the Reformation. The journey from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, it was not a light switch. It was gradual. The 13th century, the era of St. Thomas Aquinas, really was the height of the medieval church and the height of medieval theology. Starting in the 14th century, a certain decay starts to come into the church, and it's not just intellectually, not just the problem of nominalism, but also a lot of scandal, a lot of decadence in the life of the church. There was the Great Western Schism in this era, there was the Avignon papacy, and there were many popes who were just scoundrels, who lived morally decadent lives. All of this led to a call for reform. But not only does the situation in the church lead to reform, a number of cultural changes lead the way. As you can see on your screen, starting in the 15th century, maybe the middle of the 15th century, a shift begins to occur from Scripture being read in Latin to Greek making a comeback, Hebrew making a comeback. Indeed, there was a hunger, especially in Italy and then later spreading around Europe, to the classics of the earlier ages. It was known as the recursus ad fontes, the return to the sources. Whereas in the Middle Ages, the Pope's authority was, if not unquestioned, clearly established, papal authority, largely as the result of several scandals, came under attack. Moreover, as kings in Europe grew more powerful, the political incentives for finding a reason to defy the Pope increased. Moreover, in the Middle Ages, texts had to be copied by hand. Technology in the 15th century, with the invention of the printing press, opens a new age in the world of information. No longer did a book have to be copied by hand. Rather, books could be mass-produced on the printing press. That led to Bibles being more available, not just to clergy, but to the masses. It led to commentaries and treatises and all sorts of literature being made available. Moreover, the monasteries, while they had given rise to universities, and the mendicant orders had taken part in that as well, universities acquire a life of their own during the Renaissance. They start to lead scholarship. Moreover, Europe had become pretty self-contained. By the mid-15th century, especially after the fall of Constantinople, the Christian church, at least the Western Christian church, was more or less entirely European, notwithstanding a few pockets elsewhere. With the discovery of new lands, beginning with the time of Christopher Columbus, this would start to change, but even then, the worldwide church would have a very different look. All of this is background for the road to the Reformation. Already in the late 14th century with John Wycliffe in England and then later Jan Hus in Bohemia, what's now the Czech Republic, attempts at reform had been made. Wycliffe would be condemned after his death. Hus would be put to death by the church, accused of heresy. But their ideas were influential, so that in the early 16th century, the three main Protestant Reformers, Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland, Martin Luther, of course, in Germany, and John Calvin, also in Switzerland, were able to get a following and eventually get political patronage. One other name that merits our attention is Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus of Rotterdam was an important biblical scholar and more broadly a humanist of the early 16th century. Unlike his contemporaries, he did not break communion with the Catholic Church, but he wanted to see the Church reform, and urgently. In our next class, as we move to talking about modern exegesis, we will see the fruits of Erasmus's labor, as his Greek New Testament lays the foundation and sets the agenda for all the future biblical research that would be conducted in the last several centuries leading up to the present day. Until then, read well and pray well.